Well, week 11 of our study of the return from exile, and we are actually finishing Nehemiah today. The main reason we're able to do 3 chapters in one chunk is because it's mostly names in the first 2 chapters. I will not walk through them one by one. You're welcome.
You always have such great stories about.
Well, from what I've read, the consensus about these names in here, right? If you recall, back in, what was it? End of chapter 7, where they determined that they needed to sort out who was going to live in Jerusalem. And that's the reason they had drawn that huge assembly. But of course, we've been spending time on the reading of the law and the feast days that were declared, and then of course the fasting and the confession of sin and the covenant that they make and the oaths they take. So now we come to chapter 11, and we finally get to that bit where they're like, okay, so who lives in Jerusalem? And I want you to note the first 2 verses of chapter 11 in particular. The leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem. In the Hebrew, that doesn't mean that they already lived there. It might be better translated, they settled in Jerusalem. So what we can look at for all of 11 and most of chapter 12 is the settling in process. So the leaders, it makes sense to have them in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to be the core of this administrative district. Best to have your leadership close together so you can meet and make decisions. But then you need more than just your chiefs and your priests and Levites. You need people to live there. It makes it more defensible. It also makes it live. So they cast lots. You can think of this as having a tithe of the people selected to live in Jerusalem, because it's 1 out of 10. Quite literally 1/10 of the people. But the second verse is particularly interesting to me because it says the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem. Does this mean there were additional ones to the lot? Or does it mean that your name was chosen and instead of, man, I gotta move, I gotta build a new house, I can't be near my fields, they were, okay, I'll do this. We don't know. But there's a blessing on those who agree to settle in this new city. Notice the term, Jerusalem, the holy city, the place where God's name is said to dwell. And so then we go into the names. But they're broken down by tribe. You have the tribes of Judah and Benjamin and Levi. There's some historic continuity here. They weren't the only ones to move to Jerusalem, but remember back when the kingdom divided, which were the tribes that stayed with Rehoboam when Jeroboam basically said, all right, everybody to your own tents, what do we have to do with? It was Judah and Benjamin and Levi. So these historic core people, core groups, will now provide the core of the remnant returnees. But there's more than this. They were the tribes originally located in and around Jerusalem when the Promised Land was conquered. So this is their historic heritage. But there's more than that. As you go through these names, you will see ancestry traced back to some very famous names. Of the sons of Judah, they're talking about Perez, literally the son of Judah, not a descendant, but an immediate offspring of Judah. They go back to Hilkiah, to Zadok, as far as, how do you pronounce it? Ahitub. And you might say, well, Ahitub, who is that? If you were to go back to David's time, that was the father of the priest who helped him escape from Saul, and was that son was the only one of the family to survive, because Saul killed the children of Ahitub, basically. And then, of course, among the Levites and the singers, you have names like Asaph, Jeduthun, the writers of Psalms. They're building up a case here that this is a continuity. There had been a break in the exile. They were restoring that continuity of heritage. And of course, with the temple there, the bulk of this list is going to be priests, Levites, and what they call temple servants. They had their own district in Jerusalem, Ophel. It was on that hill that led up to the temple. They had gatekeepers. Well, they'd gone to all that trouble to build a wall and put gates in it. So naturally, the gatekeepers are going to live there. But there's more than just Jerusalem going on here. When you get down to chapter 11, verse 25 and onward, they start talking about who's moving into the villages and the fields. But these aren't just around Jerusalem. They're not really named in any particular order. But that first one that they mentioned, Kiriath Arba, at that time, that wasn't even in the Judean province. That was in the province of Idumea, which was the old Edomite group. So they're going back to their heritage, whether it's in Judea or not. You've got more of those, right? In addition to Kiriath Arba. See, I wrote these down. Lachish, that's also in that Idumean territory. And that string that you get down, let me see, verse 34, toward the end of the chapter, Hadid and Nibalat, Lod and Ono, those were all over in the territory granted to the Sidonians. So not only are they moving into the Jerusalem area, but they are spreading out. In the Persian Empire, more or less, people could live wherever they liked as long as they didn't stir up too much trouble. But you have to think, they've already faced resistance of Israel coming back to its former lands. There were some pretty bold people moving into these areas ruled by the people who are resisting them, restoring Jerusalem. And some people think that possibly that's why it uses the word encamped in verse 30, that they were moving in, but it might have been a bit iffy if they'd be allowed to stay. But you see how this is working. Now that Jerusalem is restored, people are gathering into the area, and they're not just satisfied with clumping close around the city walls. They are occupying the old villages and the smaller cities that were around Jerusalem. And chapter 12 is a little confusing chronologically, put it that way. This is a recounting of the priest and Levite presence from the very first returnees up to Nehemiah's time. So you'll find a lot of old names, old friends that we used to talk about back when we started this, right? Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, the high priest, right? These are the priests and Levites who came up with them, and it starts naming names. But these names are not necessarily the names of the individuals. A lot of these are family names, and again, there's a continuity sense here. That from the time they returned through to this time where the city's built and the walls are strong, the Levites and the priests have been here. And it's not just that time period. You will find comments as we go through here, especially at the end of chapter 12, that they are performing the service of their God and the service of purifications according to the command of David and his son Solomon, because long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God, and they are restoring all of this. It's not just enough for the physical city to be restored. The spiritual city needs restoration. And that is important to keep in mind as we get to chapter 13. But there's this section in chapter 12 that commonly seems to be thought that it probably took place more like chapter 9. But this is the dedication of the wall. When the wall was finished, they are going to bless it. They are going to purify it. And in this ceremony, we're going back to this idea that God has made a way. He has provided them with this opportunity, and now they are going to praise him for bringing it to completion. Step one in this ceremony is we need Levites, lots of Levites. Which kind of makes sense because they've just gone through all of that genealogy of what Levites were available. Well, here we're going to pull them all in, and they are going to be the foundation of this celebration. So they've got Levites, they've got singers who had apparently built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. I mean, naturally, you like a short commute. But step two, once you've got these Levites and the priests, they purify themselves, they purify the people, they purify the gates, they purify everything and everyone who's going to be involved in this ceremony. And then the day comes. So they've got all this preparation made. And you have what he describes as two great choirs giving thanks. One goes counterclockwise along the wall, the other goes clockwise. One is led by Ezra, and the other is accompanied by Nehemiah. If you were to set these out just in their details, they are mirror images of each other. You've got priests at the head, you've got Levites, and then officials and singers, and they start out, they think probably somewhere on the lower side of the west wall. And they march all the way around until they meet again at the temple, effectively encircling the city with gladness, thanksgiving, and singing. This must have been an impressive day. So when they reunite at the temple, then they offer, it says, verse 43 of chapter 12, they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, and the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. When was the last time we saw this happen? If you're thinking the laying of the foundation of the temple, you are correct. Only in that case, it was a mixed noise. The young folk were really happy. They were very excited that this is a new beginning. The old folk were comparing it to the old days and seeing how far it fell short of what it used to be. And so the noise was muddled, rejoicing and mourning. But here, the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. There was no mixed emotion here. It was all rejoicing. And that's not it, right? It says on that day or about that time, people were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the first fruits, the tithes to gather them and to distribute them, and to perform the service of their God and the service of purification. Here we come back to that idea of they were doing it according to the old commands that David had established and Solomon had reinforced. And so we end chapter 12 on this clear high point that all Israel, and it says in the days of Zerubbabel and the days of Nehemiah, they gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers, and they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that was for the sons of Aaron. Everyone was provided for, and the functions of the temple were going well. But that's the end of the settling in period. Chapter 13, the last chapter in the book, is much more a story of settling. And it starts out, this is another of those chronological questions. It says on that day. It doesn't specify what that day was. And indeed, it could actually be translated much more in the vernacular. This one time, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. This is probably what we count as Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 6. It's very similar. And apparently this is news to the people. And so it says, as soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now here's where the timeline starts to clarify. Before this point, before they had read this and made this decision, something happened. But before we get into that, something happened before that. We'll start with verse 6 and work our way backwards. While this other thing was taking place, we're back in Nehemiah's first person again. I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. Remember at the beginning of the story, when the king asked him what he wanted to do, he also asked him for a time period. And apparently 12 years was the limit of it. So he had to go back to service of the king. And while he was there, not a quick journey, and of course he had to stay for a while, the king has to give you permission to go again. In the meanwhile, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah. Do you remember how Tobiah was introduced to us? Tobiah the Ammonite servant. And so this priest, Eliashib, whom you will find in these lists of priests as high up, member of the high priestly family, man of authority in the temple, he clears a room for Tobiah. Not just a little, nook somewhere where maybe if he's stayed too late talking, he can just spend the night. But it says a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. This is a warehouse. And Eliashib has cleared it out and moved in this Ammonite. You can imagine then, when, after some time, Nehemiah asked leave of the king to return to Jerusalem, you can expect some fireworks. And Nehemiah's real personality comes through very clearly in this testimony. A man so dedicated to the holiness of God, that when he comes and he finds this Ammonite set up with an apartment in the temple, verse 8, I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. All right, picture this in your mind. All right? Not a young man, and yet he is hefting furniture through the door. He probably had some servants working with him on this, but you know when you're angry, you just need an outlet for it. Well, here he is flinging furniture and giving orders to cleanse the chambers. He needs to be purified. He's had an Ammonite living in there, and bringing back the vessels of the house of God, the grain offerings, the frankincense. And in this process, he discovers other things have been going wrong. How did they not miss the storage space? Well, he finds out that the portions of the Levites hadn't been given to them. People hadn't been bringing in offerings. And it got to such a point that the Levites and the singers had gone home to make a living. And he describes it as each had fled to his field. And rather than get angry at them, he turns his attention to the people responsible for the situation. He confronts the elders, and here's what he says: why is the house of God forsaken? What was the last thing they had said in their covenant that they had made just at the end of chapter 10? We will not neglect the house of our God. And yet, they have. So he confronts the officials, and he starts putting things right. He gathers them together, puts them in their stations, and all Judah brings the tithe. And in order to keep an eye on this, he appoints treasurers over the storehouses. We have 3 names: Shelemiah, Zadok, and Pedaiah. And then, of course, they had an assistant, Hanan, because they were considered reliable. And Nehemiah breathes a sort of prayer after this. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for his service. We'll talk about that when we get to the actual end of the chapter, because he makes another such statement. But as you almost can see, he stopped at the temple first. He's finding things completely out of order there. So he sets that in order, and then he goes into the city and he finds they're violating the Sabbath again. People are treading wine presses and bringing in grain, loading them on donkeys. Wine, grapes, figs, all kinds of loads. They're bringing them into Jerusalem, and they're selling stuff. Now, what was the rule for the Sabbath? No regular work. You were to turn your attention to God and worship and praise him. But they have started, once again, conforming to the peoples of the land. And I have to say, he doesn't just take measures to stop this creeping unfaithfulness among the people of Israel. He takes on the peoples of the land also. Now, if there's one thing I've learned after 3 years in a corporate environment, is it takes guts to take on a salespeople. They have one interest in mind, and they are by nature determined to pursue that interest. So here's Nehemiah. You've got people of Tyre, the Tyrians, living in the city, bringing in fish and all kinds of goods, selling them on the Sabbath. So after he confronts the leaders again for profaning the Sabbath, then he shuts the gates. You know, the Sabbath begins as the sun goes down on the day before. So as it began to grow dark, He commanded that the doors of the gates should be shut and that they should not be opened again until after the Sabbath. And he stationed some of his own servants at the gates to make sure of it. I love verse 20 and 21. The persistence of salespeople has nothing on Nehemiah. The merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside of Jerusalem once or twice. So we're talking week after week he's doing this. And his warning is, how shall I put this? In no uncertain terms, he is determined that they are not going to be violating the Sabbath or tempting God's people to violate the Sabbath. Why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. Translate that as you will into modern parlance. That is not a friendly statement. And it works. From that time on, they didn't come on the Sabbath. Why waste your time when you could be making money elsewhere? And so the Levites, who have just gotten their supplies again, he calls them and says, purify yourselves, guard the gates to keep the Sabbath day holy. Here again, remember this also in my favor, O my God, and spare me according to the greatness of your steadfast love. So he sorted out the Sabbath, but there are still things going on in the city. Jews had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And half their children only spoke the language of Ashdod and couldn't speak the language of Judah. And next week when we close up, we're closing up with Malachi, who was a prophet of this period. And he's got a lot to say in a very brief and very pithy portion about what the problem is with this intermarriage. But we've seen this before, haven't we? As far back as Ezra, he has been dealing with this temptation to intermarry, to ally yourself with the families of the surrounding peoples. But Nehemiah is the only one who mentions this particular bad result. Children who could not speak the language of Judah, how would they know what the word of the Lord said? They wouldn't. Potentially, in one generation, you could wipe out the knowledge of the law of the Lord simply by making a generation that couldn't understand its words. And this really sets Nehemiah off. You have to make allowances for the culture, of course. But there are still some places where this is the typical mode of confrontation. I confronted them. We're in chapter 13, verse 25. Cursed them, beat some of them, and pulled out their hair. And then made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves. And he brings out Solomon. Among the many nations, there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. And do you think you people are any better? Is basically what he's saying. Should we listen to you and do all this great evil and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women? And the poster child of this appears to be the son of Eliashib. Oh, we've seen that name before. He's the one that gave Tobiah a room in the temple. But it turns out that's not all he's done. He married his son Jehoiada to the daughter of Sanballat the Horonite. And there's just something, I wish I could have seen it. Like I said, Nehemiah's not a young man at this point. So that last part of that voice, I chased him from me. I wish I'd seen what that looked like. Tearing through the temple with Jehoiada in an abject fear of being beaten, having his beard pulled out. But here's the deal. They desecrated the priesthood of God, the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites that God had made with Aaron. You remember, if you've read through Leviticus and Exodus, what the rules were for marriage within the priesthood. They were strict. High priest's family, even stricter. You couldn't even marry a widowed woman. What do you think of one of these men marrying a woman of Ashdod or Ammon or Moab? And so, yes, he was outraged at them. They had violated the covenant of their priesthood. Just for political gain and a sense of temporal security. Nehemiah really has his work cut out for him when he comes back home. And he sums it up in verse 30. I cleansed them from everything foreign. I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work. And I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. It's like, the moment I turn my back, look what happens to you people. And his last statement, remember me, oh my God, for good. Right, that's the third time he said that in this chapter. And it may sound to some people like, it's like tooting his own self-righteous horn. But remember what the word remembrance means in the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. The Lord remembered his people in Egypt. There's always an element of visitation and of provision and rescue in the Lord's remembrance. Nehemiah has not been making friends. Not among the peoples of the land and those who are allied with them. So calling upon God, saying, I have been faithful to the best of my abilities, so Lord, remember me, is a lot more like saying, my life is in your hands. I have done what you commanded me to do, what the law says is right, and the outcome is up to you. But you think about then the heritage, particularly of these two men, Ezra and Nehemiah, which we see ongoing when we get to the New Testament, that focus on the law of the Lord. Naturally, they've taken it way too far in the other direction, but they've never again gone back to what they had been before the exile. They were never again that sort of superstitious, paying lip service while worshiping other idols and things like that. They were a people of the law. And that is largely due to the dedication of these men. And what sort of remembrance God has provided for them? Well, here we are. Millennia later, remembering them, learning from them. So next week, before we get together next week, I'd like you to read Malachi. It's 4 chapters. They're very concise. I think, if I remember correctly, altogether it's only like 54 verses. And we will wrap up our study with the last voice of the Old Testament. It's not the first time we've talked about Malachi, but when you read him in light of Nehemiah 11 through 13, or even 10 through 13, it gives additional depth. It gives context, which is always quite helpful. But that's it for today.